A slew of emotions hit as this Sacramento family tries to understand how their sister, 26-year-old Chasity Sparkman, was killed on Valentine's Day.
It's especially hard for her kids. My auntie has to sit here and, deal with the mood swings, and she's trying to cope herself, so we're not okay. We're trying to be, but we're not okay.
The shooting happened around 11:30 p.m. Wednesday in the Lake Crest Village shopping center in the Pocket neighborhood. Sparkman's family says from what they know, Chasity was there meeting with her husband when things turned violent.
On February 14, 2024, 26-year-old Chasity Sparkman was shot in the parking lot of Lake Crest Village Shopping Center in Sacramento near Florin Road and Greenhaven Drive. Officers responded at approximately 11:15 p.m. to reports of gunfire. Sparkman was located with at least one gunshot wound and transported to a nearby hospital, where she was later pronounced deceased. In the weeks that followed, investigators identified two suspects, Isaiah James, described by family members as Sparkman's estranged husband, and Ayonna Burgos, identified as his girlfriend. Both were later arrested in New York and faced extradition to California on homicide-related charges. Authorities did not immediately disclose a motive, leaving the central question unresolved. What led to the fatal shooting in a public commercial center on Valentine's Day? Every case starts with evidence and ends with truth. We examine facts, not theories, details, not drama. Subscribe now and stay updated as we uncover the facts behind every case. The shooting occurred in a well-trafficked retail plaza serving residential neighborhoods in southern Sacramento. Surveillance systems from nearby businesses captured portions of activity in the parking lot before and after the incident. Officers secured the scene and began canvassing for surveillance footage, shell casings, and witness statements. Emergency responders transported Sparkman to a hospital where medical personnel attempted life-saving measures. She later died from her injuries. At this stage, investigators treated the incident as a targeted homicide rather than a random act of violence based on preliminary scene indicators and early witness accounts suggesting interaction prior to the gunfire. Within days, investigators began focusing on individuals known to the victim. In homicide cases occurring in domestic or semi-domestic settings, law enforcement commonly evaluates intimate partners or recent relationship connections as potential persons of interest. This case followed a similar investigative pattern. Family members publicly stated that Sparkman had ongoing relationship tension with Isaiah James. Although police did not immediately confirm suspect identities, investigators reviewed phone records, recent communications, and surveillance footage to reconstruct Sparkman's movements in the hours leading to the shooting. Detectives examined whether the meeting at the shopping center had been prearranged. Digital evidence such as text messages, call logs, and location data became central to understanding whether the encounter was spontaneous or planned. At this point, motive remained undefined. However, the early investigative direction suggested that interpersonal conflict was a primary consideration. Reports indicated that Sparkman and James were estranged. Separation dynamics often introduce disputes involving custody, finances, personal loyalty, or new romantic relationships. Investigators evaluated whether any of these factors were present. James was reportedly involved with Ayonna Burgos at the time of the shooting. The introduction of a new partner into a strained relationship can shift interpersonal dynamics, especially if unresolved disputes exist between former partners. Law enforcement sought to determine whether Sparkman and James had been in communication that day, whether arguments or threats had been exchanged, whether Burgos had knowledge of or involvement in any confrontation. Investigators also assessed whether prior disputes had escalated recently. The presence of a third party in a deteriorating marital relationship can introduce jealousy, perceived betrayal, or competition over access to children. At this stage, authorities had not released formal statements describing the emotional condition of any party involved. The investigation centered on documented interactions rather than speculation. Financial review is a standard component in homicide investigations involving intimate partners. Detectives typically assess bank records, shared accounts, debt obligations, and any pending financial disputes. In this case, no public records initially indicated major civil litigation or bankruptcy proceedings. However, estranged couples often experience disagreements over shared assets, rent, utilities, or child support arrangements. Investigators examined joint account activity, transfers occurring shortly before the homicide, insurance beneficiaries, employment stability of both parties. If financial strain existed, it could have contributed to conflict escalation. Economic instability can intensify already fragile relationships, especially when separation disrupts shared responsibilities. As of public reporting, no confirmed financial motive was declared. However, the financial dimension remained under evaluation as investigators built a broader motive framework. Without access to sealed court records or formal psychiatric assessments, investigators relied on behavioral history, witness testimony, and documented prior incidents. In domestic-related homicide investigations, law enforcement evaluates behavioral markers such as patterns of control, threatening communications, escalation after separation, obsession with reconciliation or retaliation. Detective examined whether Isaiah James exhibited possessive or retaliatory behavior following the estrangement. They also evaluated whether Burgos played a reinforcing or secondary role in any developing plan. Psychological motive does not require diagnosed mental illness. In many cases, perceived loss of control, rejection, or humiliation can influence decision-making processes. At this point in the case, authorities maintained procedural neutrality, focusing on documented behavior rather than inferred emotional states. Investigators reviewed prior police reports involving the individuals. In cases where intimate partners are involved, prior domestic disturbance calls, restraining orders, or assault allegations are critical indicators. Family members publicly referenced earlier arguments. Law enforcement examined whether those disputes had resulted in official reports or documented complaints. Key questions included: were there previous allegations of physical violence? Had either party sought legal protection? Were threats documented via text or voicemail? A history of escalating confrontations can establish a trajectory toward lethal violence. If earlier disputes demonstrated increasing severity, that pattern would inform prosecutorial arguments about intent. No official documentation was publicly released detailing prior convictions at the time of initial reporting, but investigators continued evaluating past interactions. Another dimension of motive analysis involves financial gain through insurance or resolution of pending legal disputes. Detectives examined whether Sparkman held life insurance policies naming James or another individual as beneficiary. In many domestic homicide cases, policy benefits represent a motive. Additionally, investigators assessed pending divorce filings, custody hearings, protective orders, property division disputes. If formal legal proceedings were underway, they could have heightened tension. Court deadlines, financial rulings, or custody determinations sometimes act as immediate catalysts from violence. Public records at the time did not confirm active divorce litigation. However, the estranged status of the relationship suggested unresolved legal or personal matters. The timeline preceding February 14th became critical. Investigators reconstructed the sequence: communication between parties earlier that day, movement of vehicles towards the shopping center, duration of interaction before gunfire, departure patterns after the shooting. If surveillance indicated waiting behavior or coordinated arrival, that would suggest planning rather than spontaneous confrontation. Escalation patterns often include increased frequency of contact, public confrontations, threatening language, attempts to regain influence. The Valentine's Day timing also drew attention. Although the date alone does not establish motive, symbolic dates can intersect with relationship tensions. Authorities focused on whether the meeting location was selected intentionally and whether it provided an opportunity perceived as controlled or isolated. The case shifted significantly when suspects were located outside California. Law enforcement tracked Isaiah James and Ayonna Burgos to New York. Their departure from California after the shooting became a focal point in the investigation. Flight following a crime can be interpreted by prosecutors as consciousness of guilt, although defense arguments may challenge that interpretation. Digital tracking, surveillance review, and coordination with out-of-state authorities led to arrests. Extradition proceedings began to return the suspects to Sacramento. This geographic development narrowed investigative theory from unidentified assailant to specific interpersonal conflict. James and Burgos were taken into custody and held pending extradition. Charges included homicide-related offenses under California law. Prosecutors began assembling evidence for court proceedings, including surveillance footage, digital communication records, witness statements, ballistics analysis. At arrest stage,